Hey guys, welcome back. Let's talk about analysis of change. Now, really, when we're talking about analysis of change, there's a specific type of analyses that can be done to model change over time within participants to ensure that you're accounting for the differences that may occur within participants and between participants. It's called mixed effect models. It's a little advanced compared to what we've been doing, but just in the ways that multiple linear regression models extend upon correlation and simple regression, mixed effect is sort of the next step from here and allows you to understand more how to do longitudinal analyses or analyses with longitudinal data because it accounts for change over time and models it within the model. However, that's beyond the scope of what we're going to be talking about in this course, but something that I want you to be aware of so that if you have longitudinal data and you want to look into how to analyze it, you can look into mixed effects models. It's also called multi-level models, or those are the common words for it. So that's key, but there are ways in which we can get a more simplistic version of analyzing longitudinal data through the framework of what we've been doing so far. And that's so we can use multiple linear regression to analyze change in an outcome measure over time. For example, an intervention study using pre and post tests. So the two main approaches, if you're within the framework of a multiple linear regression model, is you can do a standard regression and you actually compute the post minus pre, the difference. So you just calculate what the difference in the score is, and that becomes the outcome measure as the difference, and use these change scores as the dependent variable in the standard regression. So that's one in where you've collected data on people who have, say, have some performance in cognitive test at baseline. They have a performance in cognitive test at follow-up. You look at the difference and you subtract each of their scores to get the outcome variable, which is change in cognition, and that becomes your dependent variable. So you're not including the individual variables as you would in a mixed effects model. You just include the difference as your dependent variable, and then you include everything else as you would in that multiple linear regression. You can also do a hierarchical multiple linear regression model where the dependent variable isn't, in this case, the difference between the two, but it's actually just the final score, like the post-intervention measure. And in step one, you partial out the baseline by entering the pre-intervention score as the independent variable. So you actually have the pre-intervention score, so baseline, as the independent variable, and your the follow-up score as the dependent variable. And then in step two, you enter the independent variables and examine the change in R squared. So do other predictors explain variance in the dependent variable above and beyond baseline scores? So baseline scores will be will account for a large proportion of the variance, for example, in changes in cognition. And so the question is, do other variables account for the change over and above baseline measure? And so here's an example of it in terms of sleep quality. So does sleep quality explain changes in executive functioning over time? Here we have in our hierarchical model, we have executive function at time point 1 and executive function at time point 2. And then in the next model, you can add sleep quality in to see if how much variance it accounts for. So again, sorry, I've written it out here. So independent variable 1 is your baseline executive functioning. Independent variable 2 is your sleep quality, and your dependent variable is your executive functioning at follow-up 2, right? So your first model is your follow-up score on executive functioning and your baseline score on executive functioning. Then your second model is your follow-up score on executive functioning, your baseline score, and sleep. And you're saying how much additional variance does sleep account for over and above baseline executive functioning. And then you look at the change in R squared, something we're all familiar with, and we're getting a sense of what the percentage of additional variance in the dependent variable, executive functioning, is explained by sleep quality in step 2, after accounting for the variance accounted for by baseline executive functioning. And so in the regression coefficients, independent variable 2, which is sleep quality, in step 2 indicates the variance explained in the dependent variable, which is our executive functioning, after controlling for independent variable 1 in step 1. So this tells us how strong the effect of sleep quality is at time point 2. So the change in R squared is focusing on the variance, right? So what's the change in the amount of variance accounted for when we add in sleep to the baseline executive functioning? The regression coefficients are telling us what's the association after controlling for the effective baseline score. So that's really the key ways in analyzing change. So those are the two key ways. One is computing post or pre differences of the outcome measure. The other one is just using the post as the outcome measure and then using the pre as an independent variable. So yeah, analysis of changes over time can be assessed either by standard regression, you calculate the difference in scores, so post scores minus pre-score, uses dependent variable, but it doesn't tell you how much additional variance is accounted for by the independent variable over and above the baseline dependent variable. So it doesn't tell you how much is much of what you see in the R squared is conflated by the baseline score. So it doesn't tell you how much of the variance is accounted for by the additional independent variable of interest rather than the baseline score. So you could just do hierarchical multiple linear regression, which partials out your baseline score, and you enter the other independent variables to help predict variance and changes over time. So that is everything for the summary. So now what we're going to do is some practice questions. So we can see, you can test yourself, pause after I've said every question and see how you go with the answer. So in multiple linear regression, if the R between the two independent variables is 1, so we have a multiple linear regression, we have our DV, IV1, IV2. If the correlation between these two IVs is 1, then R will equal the R between one of the independent variables and the dependent variable, right? Does the correlation, remember the capital R is the correlation between independent variable and the dependent variable, adjusting for the others, is that equal to the small r between one of the independent variables and the dependent variable, right? So what is that, true or false? And hopefully you said true. Sorry, I flicked very quickly there. But yeah, hopefully you said true. So if in here, in this example, if the r between the two independent variables is 1, so that's what we see here, they're both exactly equal to one another, and then the r, capital R, will equal the r between one of the independent variables and the dependent variable. So the correlation here that we see is going to be exactly the same because they represent the same variable, essentially, right? So then the correlation between each of these independent variables and the dependent variable will be the same, right? So that's the main takeaway there. Hopefully that Venn diagram helps conceptualize that. And then the next question is, in a multiple linear regression, if two independent variables are somewhat correlated, so two independent variables are somewhat correlated with a dependent variable and with one another, the semi-partial correlations between the independent variable and the dependent variable will be what in magnitude than the correlations? Will the semi-partial correlations be equal to compared to in magnitude to the correlations? Will it be smaller in magnitude, larger, or impossible to tell? Pause the video, have a go. Hopefully you said smaller, and this Venn diagram will help. So here we have our independent variables and our dependent variable in green, and we can see that we have our correlations that are there, and the semi-partial correlations are much smaller, which are these sections here. So the semi-partial correlations between the independent variable and the dependent variable will be smaller in magnitude than the correlations between those independent variables and a dependent variable. And the next one is, in a multiple linear regression, the unique variance in the dependent variable explained by an independent variable is estimated by what? Zero order correlation squared, multiple correlation coefficient squared, or semi-partial correlation coefficient squared. Pause the video, have a go. Hopefully with this, you're saying the key term there is the unique variance. So we're looking at the semi-partial correlation squared. Keeping in mind, the zero order correlation squared doesn't take into account the overlap between independent variables. It's just the variable and the dependent variable. The R squared, multiple correlation coefficient squared, or the coefficient of determination, that's all of the variance in the dependent variable explained by the independent variable. So that's the key thing there. So it's the shared variance between them all. And the semi-partial correlation is the unique variance. So that's what we're looking for there, right? So the zero order correlation, keeping in mind, it doesn't take into account the overlap between independent variables. So it doesn't take into account this overlap here, right? So that's the key thing to keep in mind when it comes to unique variance. You're thinking of semi-partial correlation. And to assess the extent to which exercise during an intervention program explains changes in brain health between the beginning and end of the intervention, what multiple linear regression design should be used? Should it be hierarchical with pre-brain health in step 1, or hierarchical with cross products of independent variables in step 2? This is really assessing whether you're understanding what the terms in statistics mean, and if you're getting intimidated by cross products or interactions or moderation. Again, it's very much what we've been talking about for the pre-brain health and the post-brain health. You can partial at it with step 1. Option 2 has no relevance. It's largely in relation to regression for moderation. So here we're talking about the extent to which exercise explains changes in brain health between the beginning and end of the intervention. What regression design could be used? So you want to do a hierarchical and partial at the pre-brain health. So that is everything for today's lecture. Next lecture, we're going to talk a lot more detail about power and effect sizes, talking about significance testing, inferential decision making, statistical power, effect sizes, confidence intervals, publication bias, academic integrity, and statistical method guidelines. So that will be all for the next lecture. But in saying that, that's it for today. So have a lovely day, lovely week. Hopefully you enjoyed learning all about partial correlations and interactions and analysis of change, and you can take that forward with your understanding of reading papers, because all of this will undoubtedly come up, so it can help you with your statistical literacy and scientific literacy as well, and understanding of the research. Saying that, I'll see you guys in the next lecture.